Thesis on the Syncretic Society by Felipe Garcia Casals, alias Pavel Campeanu. Editor's note: this paper was purportedly written under a pseudonym by a fairly prominent official in one of the East European countries. We are asked to believe that this East European is conversant with Parsons's structural functionalism, and with Althusser's analysis of socialism as a syncretism of capitalism and communism. We do not authenticate its East European origins, rather, we are publishing this piece solely because of its intrinsic interest for Western scholars. The manuscript was written in French and was incomplete. Subsection: The Syncretic Society. 1. One cannot isolate the evolution of premature socialism from the conditions of its birth. These conditions emerged around the international collision between underdevelopment and imperialism. The historical evidence presents three different responses to imperialism as an obstacle to industrialization: a. Resignation, signifying the reproduction of underdevelopment in various forms; b. Opposition to imperialism through the formation of new imperialisms. Germany, Japan, and Italy are not underdeveloped countries, but are belated industrializers. This became manifest in world wars which the neo-imperialisms lost militarily, but won economically. See Leninist Revolution, which combines anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism, thus becoming an historical instrument of dual utility. Thus the Leninist Revolution, contrary to the militarist solution, does not oppose imperialism by imitating it, but rather by negating its very essence, the principle of the private ownership of the means of production. Imperialist war and Leninist revolution have both shown themselves to be effective paths to industrialization. Both are political routes, which prove that the non-economic oppression exercised by imperialism cannot be destroyed by exclusively economic means. But while the wars have meant the territorial extension of the imperialist model, the Leninist revolution, despite its serious subsequent deformations, continues to be tangible proof of a possible alternative to the imperialist organization of the world. This, however, only to the extent that these deformations may be corrected in time for countries of Leninist stock to avoid passing from the negation of imperialism to its imitation. 2. The underdeveloped countries, where capitalism, itself underdeveloped, prevails, have little chance of avoiding their subordination to imperialism and of industrializing. Thanks to the very imperialism which they oppose politically, their own national capitalism is able to expand, in the short run. At the beginning of this century, there was an economic convergence between national capitalism and foreign imperialism largely independent of political relationships. Under those circumstances, the Leninist strategy, seeking essentially to unite the anti-imperialist revolution with the anti-capitalist revolution, was a perfectly logical, if not the only, alternative to the perpetuation of underdevelopment. History has subsequently proven the foundations of this strategy to be sound. It has promoted the lasting elimination of external imperialist domination and of internal capitalist domination. It has promoted an accelerated industrialization, but it has not promoted the effective transition to a socialist organization of society. 3. Premature socialism thus turns out to be an effective organization for industrialization in the period of imperialism. The opposition of imperialism to all industrialization except its own is the first source of the present contradiction between socialism and industrialization. This means that anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist industrialization is not socialist industrialization, a contradiction in terms. Rather, this reductive view of socialism is the fundamental ideological illusion of premature socialism, whose essential syncretism it expresses. From a functional point of view, the deepest roots of this syncretism consist precisely in the inability of adding social affirmation, socialism, to economic affirmation, industrialization. The forced implantation of a revolutionary class structure into an underdeveloped economy presupposes the forced preservation of that class articulation. But it is precisely the absence of a natural articulation which perpetuates the incompatibility of these classes, and thus the syncretism of the whole. 4. This disarticulation stems from the abolition of private ownership of the means of production. The social character of these means of production thus contradict their technological character. The social structure, challenged by the economic reality, takes on an ideological legitimacy. The social organization aspires to dominate the economy, but succeeds only in hampering its action. The social organization aspires to independence from the economy, but succeeds only in becoming separate from it. Separation is an illusory form of independence, since independence of the social structure from the economy implies equal independence of the economy from the social structure. The unity of these separate elements, going against the imperative of history, is based on the imperative of political power. The two social elements are incompatible. The function of political power is to render their articulation at once possible, lasting, and, above all, effective with respect to the dynamics of industrialization. 5. Social syncretism thus includes a third element, an immense power autonomously organ !Z, which reproduces the incompatibility and the coexistence of the other two. In this case, then, we are not dealing with a premature socialist system, but rather with a non-systemic conglomerate within which each real system constitutes an element. What binds this artificial construction together could hardly be other than coercive force. Premature socialism represents a non-system whose goal is to become a system by harmonizing the economic organization with a social one, and not the other way around. Hence, it follows that the routine use of instruments of system analysis has heuristic value only if system analysis integrates in its premises the non-systemic peculiarity of the object of study. That is, it is possible to treat each clement, the economy, the class structure, the state, as so many autonomous systems, but not as component parts of one system at the level of a global society. It is also possible to treat the way in which these elements are articulated in order to clarify not only their functional aspects, but also, and above all, their dysfunctional consequences. 6. The syncretism of global society reappears in specific forms at the economic level. As long as the absence of owning classes and the presence of one power decisive over all of social activity represent incontestable realities, the economy cannot avoid repercussions. The most general function of this structural syncretism is to assure the effectiveness of capitalist mechanisms at the level of the production and distribution and, at the same time, their total substitution by the decisions of the state at the level of appropriation and investments. To put it differently, the role of this syncretism is to ensure the simultaneous functioning and malfunctioning of the capitalist economic mechanisms needed for industrialization. The alternative which this regime offers to the absence of the private ownership of the means of production is another absence, that of the social ownership of these same means. In turn, the state maintains the monopoly of control, not of ownership, of these means. This results in a vacuum of ownership, expressing in an absurd fashion the eminently transitional nature of this society. 7. To power based on property, which characterizes capitalism, premature socialism opposes the monopolistic control of property based on power. The underdevelopment of productive forces does not exclude their expropriation from private owners, but it does prevent their effective appropriation by the producers. The prematurity of the regime consists precisely in its determination to socialize underdevelopment. This situates society between the political negation of private property and economic possibility of social property. This cleavage appears as the vacuum of ownership of the means of production. Recourse to the economic expedient of the vacuum of property makes the syncretism of the mode of production necessary. The syncretism of the mode of production makes possible the vacuum of property which characterizes anti-capitalist industrialization. Defined in relation to this mode of property, premature socialism represents a social organization which is not so much socialist as anti-capitalist. Premature socialism is, therefore, the historical stabilization of the moment when the object of negation is as much intolerable as it is indispensable to the subject. 8. Prior to any ethical, retributive function, premature socialism has an industrializing function imposed on it by the actual condition of the productive forces. Its rule of industrialization is the same as the fundamental law of capitalism, the transformation of labor power into a saleable commodity. At this vital point, the incompatibility between the social and the economic organization assumes a paradoxical form. Labor power must be sold, but it cannot be bought. The industrializing economy rapidly extends the proletarian condition. the class of those who sell labor power, while the social structure prevents the formation of an opposing class of buyers for this same labor power, the owners of the means of production. The role of the abolished class is assumed by the state in premature socialism, that is to say, by the revolutionary power. Premature socialism suppresses the capitalist incarnation of the marketability of labor power, but not the substance of that marketability. Industrialization feeds on accumulation. With low labor productivity, the main source of accumulation is not so much the increasing surplus product as the reduction in the amount of necessary labor. In order to obtain this reduction, the state systematically imposes on labor power a price inferior to its historically determined value. Anti-capitalist industrialization thus not only requires the preservation of the commodity nature of labor power, but also the mystification of its value by dictated price. At the level of immediate economic interests, this slavery sets the power of the class in opposition to the class itself. The legitimacy of power is thus transferred from the economic to the ideological sphere. 9. Ideology projected into the future becomes the systematic negation of the real in favor of the potential. Power itself is placed in the service of the potential class to the detriment of the real one. Supplementary appropriation is a burden upon consumption. To underconsumption as a consequence of underdevelopment is added underconsumption as a strategy for accumulation. This strategy of accumulation reaches its extremes in agricultural production. The prices imposed on products have absolutely nothing to do with their value. This form of the circulation of goods more or less approaches confiscation, it merely preserves the appearance of economic exchange. Nominally abandoned with war communism, confiscation survived under this illusory form of exchange for more than 3 decades. It, more than anything else, nourished the accumulation of capital. The non-economic prices imposed on agricultural products signify the disproportionate devaluation of labor power in agriculture. In the long run, the greater the distance between the real and the recognized value of labor power, the more the productivity of labor diminishes. This is the main reason why the general productivity of labor under premature socialism is not competitive even with identical equipment, with advanced capitalism. Furthermore, within this low level, the productivity of agricultural labor is noticeably inferior to that of industrial labor. Thus, industrialization, which aims at increasing labor productivity, is itself obtained by means which inhibit the development of labor productivity. 10. Unlike pre-capitalist formations, under premature socialism the various modes of production do not coexist in parallel planes, but are articulated in one single economic process. The syncretism of the economy does not consist, therefore, in the plurality of modes of production, but rather in the heterogeneity of the single functioning mode of production. This internalized syncretism is both the product and the producer of the vacuum of property. The economic coherence of the process is matched by its social incoherence. The 3 elements, social structure, economic mechanisms, political power, exert incompatible influences in each phase of the program. This general confusion does not exclude a certain functional division. To any given phase corresponds the dominant influence of only one element. 11. Thus, political power, le pouvoir, in pre-capitalist fashion, affects chiefly the allocation of production tasks and the distribution of the social product. This element decides the situation of labor power. The capitalist mechanisms affect chiefly the articulation between production and consumption. Thanks to these, labor power preserves its commodity character, and surplus accumulation based on underconsumption then becomes possible. The plan itself is expressed in the language of the market. Labor power is thus subjected to a double constraint, a non-economic one by the state, le pouvoir, and an economic one by capitalist mechanisms. This state, le pouvoir, and the capitalist mechanisms operate toward the same goal, accelerated industrialization. The new class structure exerts a decisive influence on the appropriation of the social product, which impedes private appropriation. Thus the regime creates the possibility of suppressing traditional parasitic consumption, preparing the way for the transformation of the social product into social accumulation. The difficulty lies not only in the definition of this mode of production, but also in determining whether the very concept, mode of production is appropriate in this instance. Intellectual schemes must, after all, yield to the facts which prove that this syncretic mode of production exists from the moment when it succeeds in fulfilling its two incompatible functions, industrialization and the reproduction of the absence of capitalist private property. Due to its functional accomplishments, it may be that this is simply a mode of production characteristic of anti-capitalist industrialization. The syncretism of the economic process, on the structural level, prevents the formation of systemic unity, while at the same time permits, on the functional level, systematic performance of a negative character, the reproduction of the vacuum. In all likelihood, the reciprocal pressure between the pre-capitalist state, the capitalist economic mechanism, and the socialist class structure prevents scarcity from following its spontaneous tendency and reconverts back to the private ownership of the means of production. 12. Each of the various production relations coexists not only at the level of global society, but also at the level of the different processes. This vertical diffusion of a generalizing tendency transforms pre-capitalist heterogeneity into anti-capitalist syncretism. Thus, for example, the production relations characterizing the economic and social conditions of the working class consist of the following combination: A. Socialist determinations consisting in the absence of an opposing class, the absence of exploitation, and thus of private profit, the absence of unemployment, considerable facilities for education, housing, social security, and retirement, incomparable promotion opportunities, and ineffective priority access to leadership positions. B. Capitalist determinations consisting in the economic constraint of selling one's labor power, participation in the appropriation of the social product in the form of salary, commercial consumption, separation from the means of production and the product, inaccessibility to decision-making, and captivity in the area of self-reproduction as labor power. C. Determination of a pre-capitalist, feudal character consisting in the fixing of productive tasks and opportunities for consumption by means of coercive decisions, in the authoritarian, non-negotiable, and unfavorable disposition of the recognized value of labor power, a labor productivity generally below the normal performance of the technology utilized. This is typical of any allocative economy, and of any coercive organization of labor, the absence of an operative class organization, apoliticality, social isolation, personal dependence, the pursuit of social advancement not through revolutionary class action against the system, but through personal loyalty toward the immediate hierarchies, hence toward the system, and the reactionary substitution of the daily continuity of integrated class struggles with explosive discontinuity. Therefore, in premature socialism the progress of differentiation deviates from Parsons' model. Here differentiation does not manifest itself in the multiplication of functionally distinct elements, but rather in a functional syncretism, hence the internal disunity of each element. 13. Social syncretism is naturally also that of the power which it embodies. It defends the social structure against the economy against the social structure, and itself against both of these. It is at the same time the protector and the perturber of the social structure and of the economy. This power is socialist because in achieving anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist industrialization, it consolidates a real and necessary premise for socialism in underdeveloped countries. But the direct conversion of the social product into social accumulation, made possible by the new class structure, is severely distorted by the underdevelopment of the productive forces. In aiming to reconcile the two terms, the political power contributes its own distortion. To the extent that it assumes this role, the state also assumes a markedly capitalist character. 14. On the other hand, the state assumes a charismatic and repressive legitimacy. It adds to the economic constraint a non-economic one which aims to determine the productive tasks, and a price for labor power inferior to its real value. To this end it prohibits the producers from using any regular means of defense. All of these are profound traits of a specifically feudal character. Given the actual underdevelopment of this society, its historical origin, and the specific potential of the coercive model of feudalism, the uncontrollable propensity toward this model confers to the political state power of premature socialism its preponderant character. The syncretism of the state manifests itself above all in the incongruity of the functions it assumes. The exercise of these functions undergoes obvious modifications in the course of time. But these modifications are coupled with the immobility of its structure. Its syncretism allows the state to have simultaneous access to all coercive forms history has elaborated. 15. Structural functional syncretism is repeated in the long-range dynamic of each fundamental element. At first glance a clear incongruence is evident, between dynamism of the economy and the immobility of both the social structure and the state. This same syncretism is disguised by the apparent single-mindedness of these various dynamics. On the historical scale, each of these types of movement lacks unity. Thus, the dynamism of the economy combines the accelerated development of the productive forces with the very slow evolution of consumption and the stability of the fundamental mechanisms, the commodity character of labor power, the vacuum of ownership, the contrivance of both recourse and opposition to the market, and through centralized planning and the policy of coercive pricing. The immobility of the social structure is coupled with the frenetic mobility of individuals. The basic direction of this mobility is the transfer from agriculture to industry. The majority peasantry is rapidly reduced in favor of the proletariat, the intellectuals, and the bureaucracy. The classes remain the same, but their relationship changes. Finally, the immobility of the state relates to its essential structure, for example, centralization and uncontrollability. With the progress of industrialization, this system of direction becomes more and more decrepit. This is why the immobility of the power structure is coupled with the mobility of the personalities which embody it, and with the manner in which they tend to utilize it. 16. We have here not a mere regressive tendency, but rather a syncretism which defines the very historical trend which premature socialism sets in motion. This movement is at the same time revolutionary and retrograde. The most comfortable assumption, though not necessarily the most relevant, is that, projected in two opposing directions, the movement approaches zero. One has not to think of the industrial dynamic, however, to doubt that. It would seem more correct to say that, left to the mercy of spontaneity, each of the two directions could at a given moment prevail over the other, and thus, in order to increase the chance of progressive direction, premature socialism should replace spontaneity with strategy, ideology with theory. 17. The general syncretism of this society expresses itself inevitably in the incongruence of the value systems governing its existence. The model for the syncretism of values is provided by the most vital activity, production. The economic organization of the productive process is accompanied by the non-economic valuation of its results. This is the case for activities considered useful despite their uneconomic character, the so-called planned losses, thanks to which profitability is sacrificed to industrialization, or, more generally, to the coercive price of labor power. This is not to say that the state only opposes social rationality to economic rationality, but that it opposes to both of them its own rationality. As the defender of social rationality, the state acquires an overwhelmingly socialist character, as the initiator of economic development, a capitalist character, as an autonomous element subject to its own rationality, a feudal character. All coherent and operational value systems are at the same time rational in themselves, and irrational with respect to other, incompatible systems. That is to say that one and the same action acquires mutually incompatible values if its effect is judged according to value systems which are mutually incompatible. 18. The axiological syncretism of premature socialism, which tries to bring together three distinct rationalities, the social structure, the economy, and the state, culminates at the level of the whole in the domination of the irrational. The mechanism by which the state fulfills its function as dispenser of irrationality consists of the imposition of one element of rationality on the other. At what moment, to what degree, up to which point, and by virtue of what motivation, it does this, to the advantage or disadvantage of one element or another, these are the parameters of the autonomous rationality of the state. The privilege of imposing meta-economic reasons on economic rationality has represented after 1960 the favorite target of the reformers. Hence the spirit of the economic reforms attempted in the premature socialist countries could be translated into the proposition that it does not suffice for a given rationality to be meta-economic in order for it to be preferable to economic rationality, and that at least under the given circumstances, the autonomous rationality of the state, which tends toward arbitrary incoherence, is not preferable to economic rationality, which tends toward regulated coherence in an impersonal fashion. 19. Axiological syncretism lends a connotative quality to every human action. Line missing in manuscript: every action can become the object of judgments which are both mutually conflicting and legitimate. This independence of action from judgment makes necessary a judicial instance which is itself independent from any judgment, and thus uncontrollable and infallible. The same central confusion creates the contrary possibility: every human action could be mistaken. The independence of action from judgment leads to the unprecedented socialization of guilt, an indispensable corollary of the centralization of infallibility. Under these conditions, feedback becomes not merely useless, but impossible. The polysignification of signs makes them illegible. The elimination of feedback is the triumph of the global strategy over the operational strategy, of unconditioned teleology over conditioning. This confusion expresses itself in the enormous liberty of the state qua administrator. It judges its economic administration in social terms. This transfer of values from one domain to another allows for the growth of production which is unprofitable, hence, economically intolerable, but nonetheless useful to industrialization, hence, socially positive, to resume indefinitely, with a surprising indifference as to its true specificity. 20. All social theory is the anticipation of a process which represents the transformation of the possible into the actual. All social practice which is inspired by anticipatory theory is therefore teleological. The activity is subordinate to a fixed end. As the theory degenerates into ideology, the teleology is reversed. No longer is the activity subordinate to the end; on the contrary, the end dissolves in the activity. The transformation of the actual is reduced to its reproduction. The reproduction of the actual seeks legitimacy in its ideological representation, and the impotence of practice stripped of theory transforms the end into ideology. Implanted in ideology, the end is no longer the subject, it becomes the object of the transformation. It no longer inspires the transformation of the possible into the actual, but rather its own involution, from strategic opposition to pragmatic, empiric submission to necessity. 21. The syncretic turn of premature socialism refers to other causes as well. Contrary to the formations which preceded it, capitalism is a mode of production which devours all others to the point of becoming exclusive. Mode of production and social formation merge. Capitalism cannot exist without this exclusivist tendency. To oppose to it a contrary tendency is to prevent the existence or reproduction of capitalism. The syncretism of premature socialism therefore represents a specific form of negating capitalism, by negating the systemic homogeneity which is the precondition of capitalism. The implication is that any form of the negation of capitalism is better than capitalism itself. In this case, a negation of retrograde character would be a useful subsidiary to a revolutionary negation. The actual syncretism of premature socialism discloses at the same time the truth and the limits of the theory of the convergence of the two systems. The truth, because it reflects the objective presence of economic mechanisms shared by premature socialism and capitalism. The limits, because it omits the objective presence of pre-capitalist elements which advanced capitalism abandoned a very long time ago. Premature socialism is in a relationship of partial convergence not only with capitalism, but also with pre-capitalism. This capacity of incomplete similitude to mutually incompatible systems again proves the syncretic nature of premature socialism. 22. The word missing in manuscript, of the social formation of its constituent elements, of its dynamic, of its axiological system, and of its very identity provokes in the state a frantic need for homogeneity, expressed by its uniforming tendencies, and by the propensity to personify itself. In other words, the worst excesses of this power, its extreme centralization, excessive monolithism, and cultural uniformization, all seek to compensate for the disruptive pressure of a generalized syncretism. In the syncretic society, the hierarchy of structural elements remains lucid, while that of persons becomes extremely rigid. The absence of any objective, and therefore dominant, hierarchy makes irrelevant any definition of this organization, which does not admit to recognizing its own syncretism. From the point of view of the structuralists, it is the unity based on the dominant element and its articulations which confers to any complex the quality of structure. 23. Premature socialism deviates from this geometric image. It does not have a structural unity resulting from a coherent hierarchy of its elements. This is why differentiation becomes destructuralization, and complexity syncretism. What binds this disunity together is an organized will, incessantly reproduced, to articulate the incompatible elements. Only in this light can the state maintain a dominant position which is not the result of social processes, but is constantly being imposed on them. Being in opposition to the actual tendencies, this will cannot be efficient, except by being coercive. Premature socialism becomes less opaque through a close-up view of structural functional syncretism. This approach allows us to recognize premature socialism as the incoherent rejection of capitalism. Premature socialism achieves this by surpassing, assimilating, and regressing in relation to it. The historical regression takes place, above all, at the political level. It justifies itself by making possible the pursuit of anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist industrialization. To the extent that the state secures industrialization, it uses up the implied legitimacy of its retrograde character. In order to be efficacious, the state has become an autonomous force. To the extent that, despite its loss of legitimacy and thanks to its already achieved autonomy, the state persists in the preservation of its retrograde character, premature socialism risks being reduced to a perverted socialism, that is, to being reduced to a rejection of capitalism which is as reactionary as it is efficacious. Subsection: the premature socialist economy. 1. At the level of observation, the economy of premature socialism is distinguished by its high level of politicization and by its effectiveness in industrialization. For a full comprehension of the socialist political system, sociological analysis of the economy is unavoidable. The fundamental character of this economy is its ambiguity, the ultimate cause of which is the contradiction between its stage of development and the social character of the forces of production. It is not the contradiction in itself which is typical of premature socialism, but rather the position of the terms of the contradiction. In all previous societies, capitalism included, it was the state of the productive forces that was ahead, and their social character, concretized in the forms of property and of the class structure, that lagged behind. The political system thus needed to adapt the antiquated social character of the forces of production to their advanced stage of development. The society of premature socialism is the first to have reversed this relationship. The political system has endowed society with a class structure which reflects the effective suppression of the private ownership of the means of production. In this way, the new social character of the productive forces did not adapt to, but largely was ahead of their real stage of development. Contrary to all previous history, the technological evolution here is retarded in relation to the social evolution. The page containing Thesis 2 is missing from the manuscript. 3. Under premature socialism, the social ambience of production is the socialist class structure, and the economic ambience is scarcity. The goal of the state, which also becomes the functional task of the society, is to consolidate the social ambience by destroying the economic ambience. Premature socialism's most mobile element is the economy. It is supposed to reconcile the non-socialist imperative of industrialization with a socialist class structure. The new class structure suppresses the private appropriation of the social product. This structure is therefore the social matrix of egalitarian distribution plugged into an underdeveloped productive capacity. The social structure is non-functional because it represents an egalitarian distribution system deprived of its economic substance. This dysfunctionality is defined in relation to its socialist character. Premature socialism is thus a social organization of which the potential distribution capacity is tremendously ahead of its actual production capacity. Egalitarian class structure is a fascinating historical achievement. It is the basis on which this society will in fact build socialism. Underdevelopment is a merciless historic legacy. Under its pressure, this society is forced to take on the function of industrialization, a historic feat of gigantic dimensions unrelated, however, to the construction of socialism. 4. Premature socialism is an attempt to respond to the condition of scarcity in an unprecedented manner. This novel organization of the distribution of scarcity proves that the growth of productivity is possible without the segregation of society into owners and producers. In the long run, the economy proves totally insensitive to both doctrine and ideology, that liberation from capitalist exploitation does not coincide with liberation from privation, and that exploitation is not the cause, but the preferred form, in which scarcity manifests itself. There is no scarcity without production. As an economic category, scarcity is an indicator of civilization, that is, of that state where mutual extermination is replaced by labor, and where, therefore, nature is no longer the object of direct devastation, but of devastating production. According to these criteria, I see in scarcity the effect of social production, and not of distribution, which keeps the consumption of the producers at the level necessary for their reproduction as labor power. Though extremely relative, scarcity has remained a historical constant. All known examples of premature socialism are marked by the same fundamental ambiguity, expressed in the discrepancy between the social structure and the industrializing function. Exceptions: Czechoslovakia and the German Democratic Republic, where the discrepancy is less marked, but where its effects are exacerbated by the external pressures. The transfer of socialist construction from the ideological to the economic is accomplished through the medium of industrialization. But industrialization does not itself constitute the construction of socialism, it is only its economic premise. The constructions of socialism and pre-socialist industrialization are incompatible and at the same time interconditioned. In this system, based on an historical anti-rhythm whereby succession and causality relations are completely reversed, industrialization becomes the precondition for probable socialist construction, which, in turn, becomes the ultimate end of industrialization. 5. The most incontestable achievement of premature socialism is the stabilized negation of the private ownership of the means of production. His negation does not actually transfer the ownership into the hands of the producers, but it represents the most solid premise history has so far erected for such a transfer. Where, then, is the ownership of the means of production under premature socialism? The difficulty of answering this crucial question reflects the originality of this society. So far, all forms of property had been crystallized into specific social structures which ensure the dominant position of the class possessing the principal means of production. In premature socialism, the evolution of property does not reproduce this traditional process. There is no economic or juridical mechanism which ensures the ownership of the means of production by any one social class. This refers as well to theories of a new class defined according to criteria other than property. With the advent of new class relations, premature socialism creates a suspension of property. Prohibited by the state and attacked by restorative economic mechanisms, this non-existent property depends more on its juridical conservation than on anything else. Law can promulgate property as ambiguity, it thereby expresses correctly an ambiguous social situation. This does not stop it from laying the basis of an inevitable conflict between the two proprietary parties, the workers and the state. Unified by law, property is divided by politics. The unity of the subject and object of production cannot be based on their shared underdevelopment. The law confers social property to the producers, without assuring them of its control. On the contrary, the law assures control to the state without conferring the property on it. The control of property is divorced from its possession, which results in a property vacuum. 6. The socialist state, therefore, assumes a double function. It prevents the reconstitution of capitalist private property, and, at the same time, the control of socialist property by the producers. This doubly antinomic function is the result of the fundamental ambiguity of the system, but its manifestation is only a symptom of the meaning. The control of property does not become property, which is why the concept of state ownership seems to me appropriate in describing only the outward appearance. The separation between legal property and control of property represents the embryo of a possible antinomy. Within this relationship, the state enjoys the preeminence of the economic over the juridical. It is therefore the substitute for the social ownership which the producers cannot exercise effectively because of the general underdevelopment. In premature socialism, the property vacuum in fact expresses a social leveling, the essence of which is the sharing of the absence of property. Since it is based upon scarcity, this is already an invaluable achievement. 7. The inherent ambiguity of the economy becomes transparent when viewed at the level of its mechanism. Here value, money, salary, and surplus products interact by means of planning, which transforms productive processes into political strategy. The indifference of the economic mechanisms towards individuals is the same in capitalism and premature socialism. But capitalism as a system is, in turn, indifferent toward this indifference, while premature socialism, because of its ambiguity, has a traumatized conscience. The capitalist class structure disposes of appropriate economic mechanisms, which render it functional. The socialist class structure has not succeeded in creating specific economic mechanisms appropriate to itself. This is why the relations between class structure and economic mechanisms are grounds for convergence under capitalism, and of divergence under premature socialism. Here, the mechanisms of inequality render inoperative the egalitarian structure. Under the pressure of scarcity, this structure coexists with the mechanisms which represent its negation. Premature socialism's recourse to the economic mechanisms of the system it is negating does not at all imply capitulation, for premature socialism uses many mechanisms of the capitalist economy. Except profit. The class structure does not rule economic activity per se, but its outcome, for it replaces private appropriation of the social product with public appropriation. 8. The survival of capitalist mechanisms in a non-capitalist society is not proof of their immortality, but merely of the limits of human intervention into the flow of history. It is not, therefore, fate that weighs upon socialism, but rather an inevitable condition of its premature variant. The mechanisms engendered by capitalist property have the spontaneous tendency to reproduce this property. Thus, premature socialism can neither rid itself of these mechanisms nor accept them. Their abolition would make industrialization impossible, but their operation makes possible the restoration of capitalism. Because of the reproduction of this danger, premature socialism comes to suspect all economic mechanisms. Its intolerance towards spontaneity is transferred from politics to economics. Disregarding all moral or political value judgment, these mechanisms had a certain rationality in the context of the capitalist system. For these mechanisms, premature socialism represents an artificial atmosphere where their rationality is lost. Sometimes society seems to have preserved these mechanisms in order to attest to their noxiousness. Their effect is so widespread, and they are so based on tradition and on the immediate interests of the vast majority, that it is impossible to subject them to any thorough control. By escaping even partially from control, the economic mechanisms are contesting the ideological image of a state which wants to and must be unlimited. Up to the present time there has been no society that has not tampered with the workings of its economic mechanisms. The peculiarity of premature socialism consists in the systematic and deliberate character of these tamperings. Interference with economic mechanisms becomes a political strategy. 9. The socialist state is not the owner of the means of production because such ownership is not recognized by the law in a number of socialist countries, and there are no economic mechanisms allowing the state to use the fruits of social labor to the advantage of those representing the state. Managerial function is the only possible attribute of ownership which the state has. In this respect there is an obvious similarity between premature socialism and late capitalism. Both develop a separation between ownership and management. It is tempting to assume that this same effect is produced by the two opposing variants of the contradiction between the social character and the stage of technology of the productive forces. On the other hand, this similarity of opposites also produces fundamentally opposed effects. In late capitalism, This separation ensures the reproduction of private property, while in premature socialism it prevents the restoration of this property, and prepares the premises for possible effective socialization. Similarly, under capitalism management is constituted in specialized strata which are dependent on the owners, while under socialism, management is constituted as power on which the owners, in fact, depend. Producers base their ownership on its legal recognition and on their ability to influence or determine the activity of the management. This ability, though insignificant on the operational level, manifests itself on the level of basic orientations. It expresses itself in decisive landmarks like the impossibility of restoring private property, the rapid progress of industrialization, the moderate, but real progress of consumption, the promotion of the producers to all levels of leadership, and the progress in management techniques, manipulation instead of repression. The principal limits of this ownership are its inaccessibility to direct management, and the absence of economic mechanisms to ensure the satisfaction of the producers' needs outside of the economic constraint which obliges them to sell their labor power and reproduce this process and this labor power. 10. The separation between ownership and management gives rise to the specifically socialist separation between leadership and production. The managing power economizes itself, in the sense that it transfers methods of economic management into the activity of political leadership. The government of people is not replaced by the administration of things, as St. Simon and Engels believed. Under premature socialism, the administration of things becomes the administration of people. From the point of view of the state, people and things are perceived as productive forces. Property is not yet accumulated for the producers, but by the producers. It is their product, but not their possession. Their only real property is still the same as under capitalism, their own labor power. Even if they are no longer exploited, the producers are still deprived. The proletarian condition is transformed, but does not wither away. All this can be reduced to the observation that it is possible to totally change the form of property, while only obtaining a partial change in the form of distribution. There is no longer private appropriation of the fruits of social labor, but that is not enough to make the producer master of the product of his work. Under the circumstances, the general object of distribution remains scarcity. This reality cannot be changed by changing the system of property. At this stage, the process of distribution is less dependent on its social context than on its economic object. The leadership may appear as the owner of the national economy, without in fact becoming so. There is no economic mechanism which would permit it. To be convinced, one only needs to consider that the incomes of the leaders are independent of the economic results of their management, but not of their political position, that the form of these incomes is always a salary, and never the private appropriation of surplus value, that there is no accumulation of fortunes, and certainly none in the forms of the means of production, and that the prerogative of economic decision-making may be lost through the loss of political position. Thus this prerogative is only the manifestation of political power belonging to the leadership group, which is neither transferable nor inherited. By destroying profit, socialism has destroyed the economic mechanism which, under capitalism, measures the degree of adaptation of the management to the existing conditions in economic terms. By eliminating this gauge, socialist management acquires an original proclivity to remain indifferent toward its own effects. It is this economically unresponsive management which offers the basis for the generalized lack of control over decision-making. 12. The phenomenon uncovered is that of an unusual interaction between decisions and results in the economic sphere. The supreme law of capitalism circumscribes this relation within the limits of the immediate. There, adapting to the effects of previous actions involves shortness of breath. The superiority of socialism consists in its patience, for it can afford the apparent extravagance of overlooking the immediate effects of its economic decisions in favor of a general strategy. This decision-making without regard to immediate economic effects demands considerable strengthening of the authority of the state and of official ideology. The state can survive in spite of the harmful effects of its decisions only by means of an excessive authoritarianism. On the other hand, it is the ideology which, by relating the immediate to the strategic goals, acts as a cushion for the economic shocks induced by the decisions of the state. In this manner, The ideology fulfills a direct economic function. It cannot endow the masses with a predictive consciousness, but it gradually accustoms them to relate to the future, to an extent comparable only to the religious myth of the Last Judgment. 13. Under premature socialism, property is representative. This representativeness is not expressed through voting, but by substitution. Far from being an ideal, representativeness is indicative of the limits which society imposes on the expression of individuals qua social beings. For as long as the underdevelopment of the means of production forces the state to personalize social property, it is not in its power to do away with the separation. Born out of the disdain for the economy, see Lenin on economism, the revolutionary state maintains itself by economizing itself. The rhythm of history takes its vengeance on the rhythm of politics. The ambiguity of the relations between the state and the economic mechanisms carries over into the ambiguity of the handling of these mechanisms by the state. To the extent that the state succeeds in disturbing, and therefore in mitigating the recurrent action of these hostile mechanisms, it creates the need for its own decisions, and the condition for the ineffectiveness of the mechanisms. The duplicity of these effects reproduces the ambiguity of the system. 14. The legitimate tendency to control the inherited mechanisms becomes the illegitimate attempt to replace them. The economic objectives are defined in political terms. A separation thus appears between the economic objectives and the economy. To hinder the economic mechanisms means to prevent the economic organisms from spontaneously adjusting to the mobility of their context. Central decision-making has to be more constraining than the economic imperative. The essence of the confrontation between political power and economic mechanisms is their inequality. For under the general domination of scarcity, political power cannot renounce the mechanisms which negate it, while they can do very well, and even better, without this power. If this observation is correct, it simply means that the action of these mechanisms is in essence autonomous of this power. What the state prevents is not the operation of these mechanisms, but its natural results. Hence, there exists a spontaneous, irreducible and mutual incompatibility between the capitalist economic mechanisms and the socialist state. The latter acts as if its capacity for intervening in the economy were unlimited. But its misjudgment of the real limits makes any strategy fragile and threatens to overflow into incoherence. By incoherently opposing the economic mechanisms, the state gradually assumes their functions. It transforms itself into an economic mechanism. 15. The contradiction between socialist state and capitalist economic mechanisms is the transfigurate expression of the conflict between prematurely socialized property and the necessary vestiges of private property. It indicates the indispensable, and at the same time intolerable, character of these inherited mechanisms. The control of these mechanisms by the state aims at the protection of the new class structure. In capitalism, the class structure produces the economic function of profit, which reproduces this structure. In premature socialism, the class structure does not produce the economic function of industrialization, which, in turn, does not reproduce this structure. Here, on the contrary, the non-socialist economic function of industrialization threatens the socialist class structure. The mediator between the two is the state. As long as this dissonance is reproduced, the need for this mediation is also reproduced. This system of adjusting the dissonance between social structures and economic function is the political system. The nature of this system is much less the result of an autonomous strategy than of spontaneous adaptation to inexorable conditions. On this level, the strategy is only the language of necessity. 16. The primary function of politics is negation. Politics negates history. It believes it can impose its own law upon history, which is only true up to a point. In fact, it inaugurates a new class structure, but it retraces its steps in regard to industrialization, which, far from representing any choice, is the functional acceptance of a historical constraint. If political power were based upon a sufficiently developed economy, it would no longer be forced to transform itself into an economic mechanism. It would be able not only to destroy the mechanisms of the system of exploitation, but also to forge the mechanisms of a new system in which the economy and its traditional quality of organization of scarcity would be revolutionized. There is only one chance for premature socialism to move in this direction, to continue the industrialization of the economy and to replace theoretic industrialization by a true theory of industrialization, as the possible way towards socialism. This is the first condition for avoiding a situation where the success of industrialization manifests itself systematically as the crisis of socialism. In the 20s, the triumphant revolution did not know what to do with its victory. Triumphant industrialization, by the theoretic narrowness which accompanies it, risks a return to that same point. Subsection: The Command Economy. 1. War communism represented an attempt to bring the economy in step with the new social structure established by the revolution. Its failure confirmed Marx's thesis: the production relations cannot develop independently of the existing productive forces. This poses the problem of the Marxist character of the Leninist revolution, or more precisely, of the relation between Marxism and Leninism. The next step was a leap in the opposite direction, the setting in motion of economic mechanisms proper to capitalism, under the control of a fragile revolutionary power, whose immediate goal was that of avoiding both the decomposition of society and its own downfall. The third attempt, and the one still in force, represents the essence of Stalinism, the transformation of the state into the sole distributor of tasks and goods. The official ideology calls this the construction of socialism. This sequence indicates the unilineality of the historical retreat. The power which imposed the revolution despite the general state of underdevelopment ends by adapting itself to the underdevelopment, the deliberate disregard of which allowed it to come into being. 2. From its establishment, the anti-capitalist state was forced to discover that the mere suppression of private property under conditions of poverty results only in the reproduction of scarcity. Its real function, imposed by the actual state of underdevelopment, was, therefore, not the immediate construction of socialism, but the task of overcoming scarcity as rapidly as possible through industrialization. The historical contribution of the state consists in the achievement of both the lasting abolition of the private ownership of the means of production, and of industrialization, two revolutionary transformations, which being historically concomitant, are incompatible. The mechanisms of this achievement lie in the suspension of capitalist economic competition and its replacement by a command state. Capitalist competition, based on formal equality before impersonal laws crystallized in the marketplace, is a system for the distribution of inequality. The general equality of the market is cancelled out by the inequality of the means allowing for the utilization of these laws. The inequality of means is, above all, the inequality of property, the continual embodiment of discontinuous competition. Implanted into the exterior of competition, property is at the same time the premise and the goal of competition. This is why the suppression of private property would be inoperative without the suppression of capitalist competition based on the laws of the market. 3. To be more exact, under premature socialism, command does not mean the elimination of the laws of competition, rather, their systematic disruption, which succeeds in depriving them of the attainment of their goal. The decreeing power, octroi, manifests itself not only in the disruption, but also in the operation of these laws. They function to the extent that the state tolerates them. In reality, the model of a competitive economy is only methodologically valid, for capitalism itself tends toward the destruction of competition by monopoly. The alternative to capitalist competition is socialist allocation, and socialist allocation should represent the democratic organization of the distribution of resources. Even in advanced countries, socialism at the beginning could hardly be anything but a transition from the competitive to the allocative organization of the economy. Premature socialism should not, therefore, be jarred with striving to replace competition by allocation, but with the fact that it bases the latter on the non-economic pair of centralization constraint. Mutilated socialist allocation becomes command. The first task of centralized allocation is eminently restrictive. It consists of the prevention of appropriation. 4. The transformation of the revolutionary state into the command state represents the use of an essentially feudal mechanism, production and consumption being equally regulated by non-economic constraints. The improvised application of a system appropriate to conditions of abundance and to conditions of scarcity is what gives rise to the command economy. This is the first source of dogmatism. The intolerance of the environment toward principles is merely the expression of the contradiction between socialism and underdevelopment. The instrument destined to control this contradiction is the feudal-type state, which, although shaped by underdevelopment, yet believes itself to be independent. The exercise of command makes the autonomization of the state with respect to society not only possible, but necessary, for in every system of command it is essential to have an instance in which the military, repressive, ideological power can place itself above the rules. The inconsistency of rules, hence of the laws, is a condition inherent in command systems. The general goal of command is to resolve by means of decision the same problems which competition solves spontaneously. The fundamental instrument of command, under premature socialism, is the plan, but the legitimacy of this command is not so much economic as moral. Its morality lies in the effective negation of private ownership of the means of production without regard to the economic irrationality of this negation. The commanding power thus becomes the embodiment of social justice, which assumes the form of an equal absence of freedom of choice of both employment and consumption. Thus, justice lies within its historical limits, it aspires to being a less inequitable distribution of coercion. Command cannot help legitimizing itself by the confidence which the commanding subject always inspires. As pure as it is rudimentary, the form of this confidence is the attribute of infallibility. 5. The alternative to the market presented by premature socialism is the charismatic leader. Over and above a deplorable abuse, he represents an economic mechanism whose function is to make feasible, and therefore tolerable, a distribution of scarcity which favors production over consumption. Coercion is not the alternative to command, but rather its essence, for the real function of command is the distribution of restrictions. This is why in underdevelopment the socialization of property begins with the socialization of coercion. The main function attributed to command is the interdiction of private property, hence, of profit. A derivative function, which is a result of centralization, is to withdraw the process of accumulation from all social control. Thanks to this withdrawal, the development of production based on the sacrifice of consumption becomes possible. These functions imply the negation of profit, social control, and consumption placed in the service of one affirmation, industrialization. 6. The Marxism of Marx is the consonance between necessity, theory, and activity, Leninism the alliance of action and theory against necessity, and Stalinism the sacrifice of theory, leading to action which is entirely submissive to necessity as crystallized in the command system. Leninism is the doctrine of the seizure of power by the anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist revolution, but not of how to use this seizure for the construction of socialism. The essence of Stalinism lies in the confusion between anti-capitalist industrialization and the construction of socialism. Because of this essential confusion, premature socialism loses understanding of its own identity, and, as a consequence, loses control of its evolution. The resulting principle of Stalinism might be reduced to the postulate that any means useful to industrialization is good and can therefore be assimilated into socialism. The imperative of rapid industrialization presupposes a high rate of accumulation. Under conditions of imperialist hostility, the main source of accumulation remains the surplus product. In order to increase it, the wage has to represent a price of labor power lower than labor's real value. For the producers, the basic form of appropriation remains the wage, hence the specifically capitalist sale of their labor power. The sale of labor power remains an economic reality, but its purchase, thanks to the intrusion of the command state, turns into mere appearance. This appearance expresses itself in the economically fictitious price of labor power. This implies the non-negotiable determination of wages. Thus, non-negotiated wages become, independently of their level, a coercively allocated resource. 7. For command to be effective, the suppression of economic dialogue is necessary, hence decisional monologue. This condition is fulfilled by the devitalization of all professional, political, and social organizations which the producers have created for their defense in the course of the class struggle. Command, which excludes economic competition, also excludes institutionalized class struggle. Faced with the class from which it emanates, the commanding action of the state is triply coercive, obtaining more production, fighting lower consumption, and by ruling out all opposition of the producers. Expanded accumulation based on a drastic reduction of consumption is a law, characteristic of capitalist industrialization, from which premature socialism has not known how to escape. Initially, at least, this antinomy tends to gravitate toward a separation of work and needs. The perfect model of this antinomy between productive labor and producers' needs is forced labor. 8. This type of accumulation is conditioned by the ability of the state to impose unprofitable prices. Premature socialism draws its inspiration from the model of monopolies. Maximum profit and maximum accumulation both call for the same mechanism, which consists of maintaining the price system in order to violate its rules. To the filter of economic prices, situated between the need and its object, is added a second filter of non-economic, coercive prices, making the satisfaction of needs even more difficult. At the beginning of industrialization, the aim of production is its own expanded reproduction. As long as the development of production does not itself demand an internal market, consumption, i.e., the economic rationality of needs, is a hindrance to accumulation and to the rationality of industrialization. Under any organization of scarcity, needs are forbidden from manifesting themselves other than in the mystified form of economic interests. But the organization of scarcity characteristic of premature socialism opposes this manifestation. As long as use value assumes the prohibitive form of exchange value, human needs assume the mystified form of economic interests. These two mutually disruptive transmutations characterize all unequal systems of the distribution of insufficiency. The general forms in which interest manifests itself are the private ownership of the means of production and its contestation. Since premature socialism forbids any form of property and the contestation of its specific absence, it rules out the most general forms in which interest could manifest itself. The actual suppression of the private ownership of the means of production gives rise to a tendency for the direct affirmation of needs to be rendered inoperative by the reality of scarcity, and by the absence of social property. The actual scarcity gives rise to the tendency that the direct assertion of interests be rendered inoperative by the reality of the social structure which excludes the possessing classes. Reduced to a negation of interests, the assertion of needs remains in evidence. In a regime of scarcity, needs cannot but manifest themselves as interests. On the other hand, the market economy produces and reproduces incessantly the mystification of needs as interests, which the social structure drains of finality by preventing the formation of a class of private proprietors of the means of production. 9. A class structure of non-antagonistic classes should liberate needs from their mystification as interests. The opposition of such a structure against the economic element is, at the same time, an opposition against interests. The social organization and the economic organization, the system of needs, and the system of interests, thus prove incompatible. Their unity cannot, consequently, represent a synthetic system, but rather an antithesis reproduced independently by the command action. The cleavage between need and interest manifests itself as a cleavage between economy and law. The law condemns the behavior which the economy instigates. The restrictive force of the means of coercion must be superior to the stimulative force of the economic processes. Divorced from the economy, the law limits itself to legitimizing the monopolistic exercise of coercion by the state. Freed from their mystification as interests, needs are in fact deprived of their only opportunity of expression, under conditions of scarcity. Such freedom means abandonment. The producers, alienated from their product, are also alienated from their means of defense and organization. To the capitalist mystification of needs as interests, centralized allocation opposes the double mystification of preserving the economic mechanisms which transform needs into interests, and preventing them from activity in this direction. 10. Command thus appears as the specific form which premature socialism imprints on the non-specific contradiction between needs and interests. The most general function of the commanding power consists of reconciling an essentially capitalist process, industrialization, with the absence of capitalist-type property. In order to achieve this, the state engages in a dominant mediating activity, which places the state both above the economic process and above its false crystallization in the class structure. The class structure is created and imposed by the state in spite of the market economy. The market economy imposes itself on the state by its spontaneous tendency to dissolve this class structure. As a result, the dominant mediation of the state expresses itself through differentiated behavior towards the two elements. For a long period, this function aims at reproducing the incompatibility of the two elements. Faced with a desirable social structure and an inevitable economy, the action of the state also splits into systematic protection of the class structure and systematic disruption of the market economy. This mission of disruption explains by itself the tendency of the state to assume a feudal-type organization, for it has accumulated the greatest wealth of historical experience as perturber of capitalist economic mechanisms. Banished in both its private and social forms, property ceases to be the decisive force of social life. This role reverts to the state, which, as a result of the fact that it assigns the property, loses its revolutionary character. To the interpersonal laws of economic competition, which are proper to capitalism, the state opposes the personified law of power, proper to feudal organization. To prevent impersonal competition under conditions of scarcity is to render the subjectivization of allocation economically necessary. The replacement of competition by command demands the replacement of impersonal allocation by personal allocation. Command thus seems to put an end to the capitalist dissolution of human relationships into relationships between objects. In fact, however, this successful reconversion to personal relationships is only a return to relationships of personal dependence which are proper to pre-capitalism. The domination of man by scarcity thus assumes the reactionary form of personification. Premature personification does not have human relationships as its content, but the old social relationships of inequality. The arbitrariness of the market economy comes under the control of a political authority which is against arbitrariness in the form of an individual subject personifying command. The essence of competition is the alternative. Therefore, the actual suppression of competition implies the suppression of alternatives. The effective negation of economic competition demands its substitution by a mechanism representing not only non-competitiveness, but the very impossibility of competition, the commanding power. Economic competition is a form of the distribution of inequality. Perfect knowledge and foresight would produce the paralysis of all competitive activity. 12. The concept of perfection, and, hence, of infallibility, adopted by premature socialism is the convulsive expression of the negation of competition. Incompatible with all modern organization of society, this concept is even more of an aberration for socialist organization. Its adoption represents the crowning of the retrograde organization of the state. Recourse to infallibility is also the product of the excessive and premature ejection of the regulatory effect of the market. Here feedback is replaced by action, and adaptation a posteriori by foresight. But the absence of feedback information leads to the transformation of foresight into prophecy. Infallibility is thus the medieval solution to the specific contradiction of premature socialism between the denial of information qua market and the constraint of foresight qua plan. On the other hand, a society can hardly accept the advantages of the command economy without simultaneously accepting the costs inherent in it. Submitting the commanding authority to the democratic control of society would signify the institutionalization of doubt concerning the legitimacy of their authority. In order to be effective, the commanding authority has to be, 1. Hence extremely centralized, stable, hence not subject to competition or to the whims of elective systems, and infallible, hence charismatic and above the law. The social order only can be assured by the oneness of the commanding authority. Once the system is in place, this condition acquires, within limits, the force of necessity. The official ideology expresses this necessity in the form of two fundamental principles: monolithism, justifying centralization, and the leading role of the party, justifying the absence of competition and the charisma. State power not subject to elections necessarily becomes the distributor of non-eligibility. The construction of hierarchical strongholds, founded on relationships of personal dependence, presupposes command over functions. Here election is but the semblance of appointment. A true elective system would be profoundly disturbing to the survival of command. 13. To demand the democratization of premature socialism therefore means to question the command economy and the system which the latter has built itself. Political democracy is the complement of a competitive economy, which is impersonally regulated, the mechanisms of which are in principle accessible to all. These impersonal regulations, which under capitalism are hindered by monopolistic domination, are rejected by premature socialism, which sets up in opposition to them its command economy, the complement of which is the imminent absence of political democracy. Within the limits of the strategy of industrialization, the state acts upon the economy deliberately and effectively. But it is precisely the obligation to act in this fashion which becomes its principal shaper. By a non-deliberate process, the state gradually assumes the traits that allow it to master the economy. These traits confer on its essentially anti-capitalist orientation an essentially pre-capitalist quality, for they belong to any command state. The conditioning of this state, which believes itself to be unconditioned, lies essentially in this spontaneous adaptation to the combined pressures of underdevelopment and anti-capitalist industrialization. This conditioning is incorporated into the historical evolution of the state. Its autonomy, which allowed the state to avoid the danger of dissolution of the new class structure in the process of industrialization, becomes itself, after this achievement, the main danger. 14. At the present level of industrialization, the feudal opposition to the capitalist mechanisms of the economy represents a more severe danger than the mechanisms themselves. The non-conditioning of the state is but the mystified appearance of its unknown conditioning. Uncontrollable conditioning becomes the non-selective adaptation to external impulses. The intrinsic structure of the state is the sedimentation of the extrinsic pressures to which it spontaneously adapted. To the spontaneity of the economy, the pragmatic state opposes its own spontaneity. The realm of necessity changes its form, not its substance. To study premature socialism is to study the way in which it is molded by its conditioning. To study its conditioning is, above all, to study the general laws of industrialization and the general laws of coercion in the state. The task of anti-capitalist industrialization is unavoidable. What is avoidable is the spontaneous adaptation of the political structure to the recoils of its allocative function. The theoretically uncontrollable pressure of these objective factors confers upon premature socialism, as compared to advanced capitalism, a profoundly retrograde character. 15. Premature socialism has become divorced from the theoretical force which permitted its birth and which it continued to invoke in its search for legitimacy. The abandonment of the theoretical approach implies submission to the economic constraints of industrialization, and to the political constraints of command. The measure of the distance between the initial theory and official ideology is the fact that the latter is but the apology for the mutilations inflicted by the loss of the former. No theory can eliminate the inexorable impact of underdevelopment. But a Marxist theory of premature socialism would be capable of reducing the damage thereby inflicted, and moreover, of limiting the transmittal of the impact, in forms which would aggravate it into all domains of social life, and into the organization of the state in the first place. The pre-modern character of this state is also demonstrated by the pre-modern character of the claims opposed to the various movements which aim for improvement. 16. Premature socialism is a schizoid society, revolutionary because it uproots capitalism, retrograde because of the system of power which it puts in its place. Translator's note. Felipe Garcia Casals is held to be the pseudonym of a fairly prominent official in one of the East European countries, interested in having his/her paper discussed by Western scholars. The manuscript I was given was written in French. Irina Livizenu and I made the translation. Our task was made difficult by the fact that 1 or 2 lines and one entire page were missing. Further, the language of the original is rather condensed and, in some places, opaque, but we were not able to consult with him/her and can therefore do no more than apologize for the resulting deficiencies in the translation. After a good deal of experimentation with other formulations, we have decided to translate le pouvoir, in most cases, as the state, even though the author at times has used l'état and thus obviously distinguishes between the two terms.